So, the Epstein files have given us a flavour of the way in which elite financial interests, the distortion of state functions, and gender imbalance converge to undermine the rule of law. Now, Ann Pettifor, the economist who predicted the 2008 crash and was one of the architects of the Green New Deal, has written a new book which explains how this very same global elite have also rigged the financial system. Ann, welcome to Pod Save the UK.
Thanks, Nish. Great to be here.
It's a hell of a thing. Is it a weird thing to walk around with that tag of the person who predicted the 2008 crash?
Yeah, it is a bit, really, because actually quite a few others predicted it as well. But I must say, I'm one of the few women that did. You know, I'd written a book called The Coming First World Debt Crisis.
Yeah.
And I tell you, it felt like a lead balloon. I mean, that was a book that didn't sell. And everybody just said, oh, she's that old lefty, don't take any notice of her. But then amazingly, after the crisis broke, people began to say, oh, that little woman, so it's been quite nice.
Okay, well, referring to a book that didn't sell is an incredible way to open a conversation that starts with your new book. Your new book is called The Global Casino. It's absolutely brilliant. Before we talk about the issues it raises, just spell out to us the concept of the global casino.
So I wanted to make people aware of something economists call the international financial and monetary system. And I want ordinary people, when I say ordinary people, I mean me and you, to understand that this is like a sort of construction. This is a construction, it's a kind of architecture. And I envisage it as a casino because actually there's so much gambling that goes on in there. But what I want to show people is that this is like a giant casino, and inside the casino are little booths. And these are countries. This is Britain, this is France, that's the United States, China, that's South Africa, this is Sierra Leone. And they're inside this giant casino. And people inside the booths scarcely aware of the fact they're inside a casino.
Yeah.
The key thing about the booths is that they've got their doors wide open and they never close their doors, with the exception of China.
Yeah.
And so people in the casino, which are mainly gamblers, speculators, or what are they called? They're called in the financial system, but also gangsters, the mafia, terrorists, drug dealers. They're all, swanning around inside the casino, and they can dip into the doors, through the doors, into our economies and out again without any friction. But in reality, it means all these speculators, plus all the criminals associated with the casino, are sort of doing us huge harm, and we don't know it exists. And partly that's because it sounds like something remote.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make it into a territory, and I wanted that territory to take shape, and the shape is a casino. And the key thing, and here we get back to dear old David Graeber, is that we constructed that casino.
Yeah.
And we can just as easily deconstruct it and reconstruct another system.
There's the derivatives market, there's people investing in speculation, essentially. But a lot of one of the most alarming things about the book is how it explains how your pension is part of that investment. They're not gambling with their money a lot of the time. They're gambling with your money. And how was that, say, just specifically taking the example of the UK, how did we get to the point that has been allowed? What measures of deregulation have brought us here?
So it starts with the privatization of pensions in Chile back in the 1970s. And Mrs. Thatcher gets wind of this and thinks, oh, why don't we do that too here? And BlackRock comes along and scoops up our pensions and says, leave it to me. I'm going to invest your pension in, I don't know, the US dollar, which never falls in value. Or, in whatever gold or silver or whatever I think would make you more money. And we say, fine, here it is. So we're extremely vulnerable. So the point of the book is to say, this system impacts on you, dear reader, on a daily basis. Your pension, the price of your food, because, all these agricultural goods that are traded, and energy. These are key things, not to mention house prices. That open door means capital can flow into your country and inflate the value of your properties and render you homeless. And because we're ignorant of that, we blame our neighbours, we blame supply and demand, but we don't blame the system.
This is a very interesting week for you and me to be having this conversation because
Absolutely.
journalists around the world have been digging into the Epstein files, and we're getting some sense through this story of the architecture of this kind of shadow banking system that the book points out.
Yeah.
In the book, you write about how the globalized financial system operates beyond the reach of regulatory democracy and the law. So one
Yeah.
big revelation this week has been Peter Mandelson leaking sensitive information to Epstein, and the police are reviewing claims that when he was business secretary, he gave advance notice to Jeffrey Epstein of a bailout from the European Union. Now, and can I just take a guess that you have not necessarily been as surprised, say, as some of us have been
No.
by some of the revelations, not just this EU bailout, but also the fact that Mandelson, seemingly at the instruction of Epstein, was lobbying about bankers' bonuses in 2009.
What's really bugging me at the moment, Nish, is that none of the big media outlets are focusing, except for the Financial Times.
Yeah.
And Jim Pickard must get real credit for this. Nobody's focusing on the fact that this is a Wall Street story. This is a banker's story. And they wanted to attack the post-crisis regulation. Now, we were watching all this from here.
Yeah.
And there was something called Dodd-Frank, where finally the government said, after the great financial crisis, in which millions of people lost their homes, their jobs, they suffered divorce, they committed suicide. After all of that chaos, we're now going to manage the system.
Yeah.
We're going to regulate it. And then as we watched them talking through the Congress, talking through Dodd-Frank, we noticed that it was being diluted. And we wondered, I blamed all the Americans. I kept going on about those Americans, blah. Turns out it was a Brit.
Who says we're a waning global power, Anne?
Exactly. I mean, so then, there am I being so unkind about those Americans. And it turns out it was the Brits.
You write about how in 2021, the world lost $144.8 billion in tax revenues to tax abuse related to offshore financial wealth. Now, there are allegations that Epstein was part of a system that created offshore structures for powerful people. What are the implications for the structures of democracy and the rule of law when capital essentially supersedes the will of democratically elected governments?
You've just told the whole story of the book. That's what the book's about, really.
Spoiler alert warning.
But the point is this. You're in this little booth called Britain inside the casino, and you're worried about how you're going to tax these guys going in and out of your economy.
Yeah.
The idea that you're going to say, we're going to tax you, and they're going to sit there and be taxed is ridiculous.
Yeah.
They're taking their profits and their capital gains into tax havens the minute you mention it.
What does a kind of legislative response look like to actually close those doors down? Is it international cooperation?
It's called macro-prudential rules, basically. And if I could give you an example of one, I noticed the other day that Elon Musk threatened he was going to buy something in Europe. Oh, Ryanair. That's right.
Yeah. He got in a. I don't even know how he's managed this, but he somehow managed to get in a pissing contest with Michael O'Leary, the owner of Ryanair.
No, exactly. And what happens? The European Commission says, sorry, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
That's a capital control.
Yeah.
That's saying we're closing the door to you, Elon Musk, when it comes to our airlines. These are things that the central bank can do, that government can do, that the European Commission or the British government can do to sort of manage. I'm not against money flowing in and out because we all want to go on holiday to Costa Rica, for God's sake. But what we need to do is manage those flows. And I always say, can you imagine the boss of Apple saying, I'm not going to manage flows in and out of my business. I'm going to leave it blah. Nobody would do that. And we do that. Our governments do that as a matter of policy. And the deregulation, the key thing happened in 1971 when effectively the J.P. Morgans of this world persuaded governments to lift any management of capital flows or, of the regulatory book. And we did. We obliged the financial system. They can't believe their luck. Nor can drug dealers. If you're running county lines and you're looting young men, vulnerable young men, of all their money, and you want to transfer it back to Colombia, nobody's going to stop you. And we sit around and don't worry about that. Sorry, I get very het up about these things.
That's fine. Getting het up is the sort of raison d'etre for this podcast, Anne. It's absolutely fine. It's a show presented by people who get het up and listened to by people who are getting het up. So it's absolutely fine for you to be het up. I want to come back. Well, I don't want to come back to Elon Musk. I never want to speak about the man again, but I'm obliged to come back to Elon Musk. But before we do, the 1971 incident that you're referring to is really important to the core of the book. It's when the Nixon government essentially moves the economic system away from and essentially abandons the principles of Bretton Woods, right? Can you just briefly explain that? Whenever I read stuff about this subject, we've always identified, things like the Pinochet Chile government. We've always identified Thatcher and Reaganism and talked about post-1979 economics. This was not something I was aware of, and I was not aware of the significance of what the Nixon government did. Could you just briefly outline that?
Yeah, so we love to talk about the politics of this stuff, and I'm saying talk about the economics of it, because the economics is highly political. So after the war, Keynes and a bunch of economists at Bretton Woods had sat down. It was really interesting. Roosevelt refused to allow any Wall Street bank to attend the Bretton Woods conference. So it was only economists from the North and the South, actually. And
which, again, is such an important precedent.
45, they looked back at the 1930s when they had these vast bubbles, when they had the 1929 crash, which was followed by a catastrophic world war, never mind unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. And they thought, that was crazy. We must never do that again. So they sit around a table and they say, we've got to manage capital flows. We've got to manage this trade. We've got to do that as well. And we've got to manage the currencies that we use in trading. And they win most of the arguments on capital mobility. The Americans and the rest of the world agree we've got to manage capital cross-border flows. And they also agree that we must manage trade. Where they don't agree is that the dollar should be the world's reserve currency. That's just what the Americans want. Okay. Anyway, so between 45 and 71 is a period known to all economists on the left and the right as the golden age of economics. The golden age. Employment was high. Even the poor countries in Africa were expanding their economic activity and doing well. What happened then was America decides to go to war in Vietnam, and they get into debt. They get into debt, and getting into debt in your own country, where you've got a bank that issues the currency and manages the amount of credit in the economy, is one thing. But getting into debt with foreigners is another. You've got to repay your debts in a currency called the dollar. But the Americans are getting out of balance, right? And any low-income country will tell you they know what this means, because this is what happens when the IMF zooms into a country and tells them to structurally adjust their economy. The Americans would refuse to structurally adjust their economy. They should have, if you like, stopped buying from abroad and invested more at home. But they chose not to do that. They kept wanting to buy from abroad. And so the answer to that was to say, to hell with this standard for balancing the books. We're not going to pay anymore. We're not going to pay the dollars relative to gold. Nixon decided to do this without consulting the rest of the world. He goes on the television and said, we're not going to repay our debts in the way that we promised we would do before. And if you don't like that, go and jump in the lake. And so they simply default on their obligations to repay their debts in the way that was agreed. And that's the sovereign default. Economists won't call it that. I don't know why, but they don't call it a sovereign default. But it's what, poor countries like in Africa do. That's what the Americans did. But instead of the IMF flying in and saying, structurally adjust your economy, restore balance, they said, it's the Americans. The only one who really disagreed with this was President de Gaulle. They sent a battleship to New York to retrieve their gold from Fort Knox. And they said, we don't want your greenbacks. Because what Nixon said was, we haven't got money to repay you in that way. But what you can do is you can borrow one of our government bonds. And if you hold that, we'll pay it over 30 years. And, so there's you'll get that in return for it.
Yeah.
And as I say in the book, it's like going to your tailor and saying, please make me a suit, and paying your tailor, and then your tailor paying you back again. And you're thinking, well, God, if I've got that money again, I'll have another suit.
Yeah.
And that's how the Americans treat it, we lent them money. So they kept buying and consuming, and eventually huge imbalances built up.
Right. Let's look at Elon Musk and use him as a sort of way into discussing one of the biggest financial risks taken by Wall Street in the last few years, which is the gamble on artificial intelligence. It's technology that doesn't exist yet.
No.
In real terms.
No.
Now, I'm not an expert.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem smart. It doesn't seem particularly wise, and it feels like a huge bubble that's about to burst. So with Elon Musk, SpaceX announced a $1.25 trillion deal this week to acquire xAI, which is a company also founded by Musk, which was announced last month to be the recipient of a $2 billion investment from Tesla, which is another company owned by Elon Musk. According to a Reuters source, xAI was valued at $250 billion. We're talking about technology that doesn't exist, and we're talking about companies being bought by other companies owned by the person that owns all the companies. Please help me make sense of what's happening here.
So you've got to start with Twitter and X, right?
Okay.
So he pays crazy, crazy money.
Like way over the odds. Like
way over the odds, just to have the power of that platform,
Yeah.
right? And it's given him huge power, let's face it. So what is he doing? He's merging his companies to invest money effectively in Twitter, ultimately, to put some of their surplus into the deficit that Twitter's built up. And he's, to be fair, he's got a surplus in X space or whatever it's called. But that's all that he's doing. This is where the crunch will really come from. Because what's happening with AI is that all these big platforms have loads of cash because we're just handing it over.
Yeah.
We hand over our data and they monetize that like crazy. And we are so happy for them to do that.
Yeah.
They can't believe how much money they're reeling in. But what's happened now that even though they have all that cash, they've actually run out of cash because they've invested so much in this non-existent asset called AI. They're now having to borrow, and they're shifting that off the balance sheet, really. And the huge big five corporates involved in AI, they're competing with each other to deliver all this stuff. But they can only get better and compete with each other if they build more data centers. That means they need cash to buy land and invest in data centers, which burns up huge quantities of energy, right, and put up our electricity prices probably in the end. And this is why Musk is talking about going to the moon and sticking his data center on the moon. It's complete bonkers madness, really. And it's all, if I may say so, thanks to the casino.
What you're saying is we shouldn't look at the AI bubble as something distinct or in any way separate.
Yeah.
And we should look at tech companies as being distinct or separate.
They wouldn't have that cash if they couldn't be siphoning it off every country in the world. And we've given them the whole world to play with.
If the entire stock exchange in the States is kind of based around AI companies and companies like NVIDIA that make the hardware, but all these companies are doing is essentially leveraging debts off different bits of themselves, then surely that is a bubble that's going to burst. Is it 2005 again? Am I about to be 20 again now? Will my hair go black again?
Do you know? Yes, it is.
Right.
And what's really difficult about a bubble is predicting when it bursts, really.
Right.
I predicted it would burst, but I didn't get the date right. So timing is of the essence here, and nobody knows. And nobody knows what will be the trigger as well, because it'll be some weird thing that'll blow up from nowhere that you would not expect it to be, But that it's a bubble, is commonplace now.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody is saying it. There's nothing clever about saying it. And, what's also terrifying is, and this is where we have to understand our public institutions, because what I want to make clear in the book is that these guys operate in this stratosphere, but at the same time, they're tethered to the Federal Reserve,
Yeah.
basically. And Jerome Powell has said, and I quote him in the book, don't worry, we've got all that it takes to bail them out. If you have a central bank that exists to bail out these big bad guys, these very wealthy elites, the people will get angry. The people are pissed off about it, and they're right. And, we think the people don't understand macroeconomics. We're completely wrong.
Yeah.
They get it. They can see what's going on. You and I can see what's going on, right? And they are mad as hell. And in my book, I argue, along with Carl Polanyi, that they're so mad they're looking for strong men to protect them from these bad guys. And that strong man could be Donald Trump. I was shocked. Donald Trump went to Davos and he talked to the bankers and he said, you've got to put a cap on interest rates on credit cards. That is so blindingly, obviously a wrong.
Yeah.
And it takes a fascist to make the point, really.
Yeah.
But what he's doing there is saying, don't worry, I haven't forgotten my base here. My base elected me because they said they want to, of course I won't touch Wall Street and I ain't going to mess with Elon Musk, but every so often I'm going to throw a bone.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point. This thing about Trump occasionally just says something like, you have to cap credit card debt at Davos, but he's not doing anything to really endanger his real paymasters.
No.
We saw the inauguration, you saw who was
Exactly.
sat in that room. One of the other bubbles that you identify, or potential major bubbles, is the entire insurance industry. And that's because the entire insurance industry is imperiled by the prospect of total climate breakdown.
Yeah.
And the book really, one of the things that I thought was really great was how much it explained how global casino is responsible for the acceleration of climate breakdown and is also imperiled by it. Both of those threats will impact on ordinary people. Yeah. In attempting to kind of avert this crisis, you've been one of the architects of a Green New Deal.
Yeah.
So there's a 2008 report that outlined a series of UK-specific policy proposals to mitigate climate change.
Yeah.
The Labour government was elected with a pledge that it would hardwire a Green New Deal into every level of government.
Yeah.
But the £28 billion Green Plan has been shelved.
Yeah.
Are these ideas dead in the water, Anne? And what would your message be to the Labour government on the implementation of a Green New Deal?
Well, there's two things. On the insurance industry, I live in a little town called Saxmundham in Suffolk, and on the coast is another village called Thorpeness, and it's literally being washed away by the storms this last few weeks. This is happening across the coast in England. This is because the seas are rising, and this is because temperatures are rising, and the scientists have been telling us that for a very long time. Now, the key thing about that is that people bought their houses at great expense, because this is quite an exclusive little village, really. It's a sort of Islington by the sea place.
I've been down there, Anne. It's a nice place. Yeah. It's a lovely bit of the world.
Properties for 1.2 million.
Yeah.
Nothing. Insurance companies aren't going to go to the coastal properties, that people have bought. And we saw that most vividly in Los Angeles. Yeah. And the problem is that when the insurance industry withdraws, the mortgage companies have to withdraw.
Yeah.
Because you can't get a mortgage without insurance, And so this is a kind of disaster coming towards us, which we don't want to think about. And then we say, sorry, there's nothing we can do about this. There's nothing we can do about the climate. Because you know what, Nish? There is no money in the bank.
Yeah.
And this is what drives me utterly wild, that our politicians go around saying there is no money. And we all know that when the great financial crisis came, suddenly there was a lot of money.
Yeah.
When COVID broke, suddenly there was a load of money. Who got it? The rich got that money, basically, mainly because they have the power to move their capital abroad. And the point is that our monetary system, and I try to make this case in the book, is a great civilizational advance. It's something that we invented to enable us to do what we can do. And we can do something about the climate. And we can make the money system work for us. But right now, The monetary system and the Bank of England work primarily for private capital markets, for the casino, and they don't work for us, right? They work for creditors and not for debtors. They make sure that creditors get very high real rates of interest, and we debtors, and there's far more of us than there are of the creditors, we got to pay those very high usurious rates, as I call them. So, but we need a reorientation of these central banks to take into account the interests of the economy and in particular of the people of Britain. And that kind of shouldn't be hard to do. And the thing that bugs me is that the politicians sit there saying there is no money and, it's terribly sad. And they pretend to be powerless, right? They own the Bank of England, for God's sake. We nationalised the Bank of England in 1945. It's your bank. You tell your bank to do what you want doing. Now, there are limits, and of course you can't be irresponsible. But the fact of the matter is it's your bank. It's not somebody else's bank.
Yeah.
It's not Elon Musk's bank. It's your bank. And it should be working for your people.
It was so much of what you said in terms of the solutions that exist from a kind of climate catastrophe perspective.
Yeah.
And also this idea that, Donald Trump has been making hay by essentially talking the language of anti-elite politics, whilst obviously doing the opposite in policy terms. But there's a huge opportunity for progressive political parties here, isn't there? There's a huge opportunity. And it's not being taken, though, is it? But it is there, right? What needs to be done actually exists within what we would recognise to be a leftist or progressive political philosophy, right?
What it takes is political courage and it takes leadership. For me, the model is Roosevelt in 1933. In 1933, we'd had the global financial crisis, we had capital mobility, we had chaos, we had imbalances, we had the threat of war, we had the rise of Nazis, right? And he stood up and he said, I am going to break down the gold standard system. And the gold standard system was globalization pre-1945. He said, no, I'm not going to have that anymore. And the economists all said, oh, you can't possibly, blah. Let's have a conference and restore the gold standard. And he said, you can have a conference, I'm not going to attend. And he then turned Wall Street. It's funny, his finance minister was called Morgenthau. He said, we moved the government from Wall Street to my office in Washington, right? We need a politician who has the courage to say, I'm going to move the government from the City of London to my office down in Whitehall. If we had that kind of political courage, we could then tackle all of these great crises that we face.
We've done it before and we can do it again, right?
We can do it again, sure. Sure as God made little chickens. I don't know why I said that.
I'm going to start pitching a children's TV show for you to teach children about economics and then at the end say, call them all my little chickens.
Oh, dear.
And thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK. Anne's book, The Global Casino, How Wall Street Gambles with People and the Planet, is available via Verso Books. It's out now and it is absolutely fantastic.